I'm Rich Todd, and I have the privilege of introducing John Coleman. John and I and Bridget Wagner are on a panel tomorrow at 3? Is that when it is? To talk about ESG, and we are very fortunate to have both Bridget and John here. John is with Sovereign's Capital, which is probably the preeminent private equity firm in the faith-based space. They're from Atlanta. I know John, for many years, our firm is a big proponent of Sovereign's Capital and what John does. And I've heard John speak before. He's terrific. I'm very excited for this presentation. John is from Atlanta, married to Jackie, has 4 children, and we are, like I said, very privileged to have John aboard. So with all respect to John, I'd love to have him come up. Thank you.
Rich Todd is famous and very welcome in the Coleman household because the most fun client trip I think I've ever done, we got to meet with Rich and his team out in Denver, and Sloan on his team. I brought my 11-year-old son with us, which Rich and team were comfortable with. He sat still for most of the talk that we had for almost 2 hours. They pumped him with some brownies, which kept him interested. And then they took us to a Denver Nuggets game that night and got to see Jokic play. So that was, if you want to talk about loyalty from someone, Rich, I think we're all pretty loyal to the Innovest family right now. It's my privilege to come and talk to you all today about something that's pretty near and dear to my heart individually and to the heart of our firm, Sovereign's Capital, which is this idea that all investing is impact investing. We often hear that term impact investing to refer to a very specific, very narrow group of investments that you might make. But the claim I'd make is that every investment that you make has impact. The only questions are whether that's a good or a bad impact in the world, and whether you're conscious of that impact or whether others are controlling it rather than you. And so I want to talk today about what that can look like, how the structure of the industry is set up to implement values-based investing, and then how some of us can take greater control of what we do. Just to set the tone of this, how many of you are like professional money managers in the room? People who manage money professionally, like Thomas. How many of you control an institution, a diocese, a college that has an endowment or something that invests capital? How many of you, this is like investments is totally foreign territory, or you potentially wandered into the wrong room after all the winery tours? Is this? Yes, ma'am. Well, there are multiple other sections. We can give you a list if this is the wrong room. Well, hopefully there will be something for everyone involved in this. I'll start with a little bit of a story that I tell sometimes. One of my favorite commencement speeches was by the great writer David Foster Wallace, who's actually a lapsed Catholic, sadly, who in his speech to Kenyon College started with a little anecdote of 2 fish swimming along in the water. And these 2 fish were swimming by, and an older fish swims by him and tips his hat and says, "Good morning, gents, how's the water?" And the 2 fish kind of look at each other and swim off, and one turns to the other and says, "What's water?" Right? Sometimes the things that surround us are the hardest for us to see. Those things that are omnipresent are the ones that we don't even think about around us at any time. And I think that the world of finance is like that, right? Almost everything in the world today is touched by finance or financial institutions. And much of that is touched by investment management firms or investments. So today there are more than about $130 trillion in managed assets in the world. That's not including the assets in your bank account, the equity trapped in your house, et cetera. That is just assets managed by professional managers into companies or real estate developments or debt, et cetera. About $120, $130 trillion in assets. And the practical implication of that is that those assets have touched almost everything in your life. It's the debt and equity that fund the beautiful Meritage Resort, as we all know, because we know one of the equity investors. It's the private equity and debt behind the chair company that made the chairs that you all are sitting in, or the import company that imported Chinese steel or whatever the material in the chairs is. It's whatever company produced the cameras back there. It's the yogurt shop in your neighborhood where there was debt financing behind it, or some private equity firm funded a series of chains around yogurt. It's the clothes that you wear. It's everything that you touch. The water that you drink has been privatized infrastructure. those 130 trillion assets are touching almost everything that you do on a day-to-day basis, and those assets exert influence because they often have control. Today, many of those assets are in explicitly values-oriented strategies. The dominant value today that's expressed is something called environmental, social, and governance investing, or ESG. Now, this is just one of a series of values that you could hold. It's kind of an umbrella term for a series of internationally developed strategies codified in things like the UN Principles on Responsible Investing, but it's certainly not the only series of value investing. For example, the second largest, to my knowledge, would be Sharia finance, which is where Islamic sovereign wealth funds or pools of capital trying to align their values with their faith, much better than Christians do on the whole. But ESG investing is the largest category of values-oriented investing, and of that 120 or $30 trillion in assets, approximately a quarter of those are in explicitly ESG assets, right? So what is ESG? The E, environmental, stands for a series of policies related to often combating climate change, and this came out of to some extent, a guilty hangover by the Nordic sovereign wealth funds, which are all oil and gas based, as well as other international institutions that began to think they were going to have a difficult time combating climate change through traditional political channels. And so they started to advocate for those climate change policies through capital by forcing companies to adopt new policies based on their equity investments. They were trying to influence the world through that capital. And that looks like a series of things, some of which you may agree with, like renewable energy, but would extend to more radical climate change combating policies, the eradication of fossil fuels, deforestation, et cetera. So a series of different policies related to environment. The S stands for social, right? And of course, this can mean a variety of things. And I know that the Christian church in particular has a long strain of thought around justice, around social justice, in fact. But very often today, these are synonymous almost with a series of left of center or far left political causes that are executed through the assets that are stored in these social policies. This looks like fair pay practices. So, for example, big public pension funds will force asset managers or companies that they deal with to report the pay between men and women, between people of different races, and actually push those companies to adopt pay practices that are more egalitarian. They look like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they can also extend to even more controversial policies like abortion travel benefits, for example, which was a very common one over the course of the last 12 to 18 months in the United States. So the social policies are what you typically see in social policy and politics, just executed through the management of capital. And then governance looks like governance. Some of these are quite boring, actually. This is having the right accounting standards, putting out the right financial reports, separating the CEO and chairman role, but again, can include things like executive and board diversity and other mandates about the leadership of companies. And this is a very specific ideology. There are groups that exist to codify this ideology, and it's managed to gather enough steam that it's the dominant way in which values are expressed through assets today. That looks like a variety of approaches. Some of these will resonate with what your diocese or your church or your foundation or your college may do, and we'll talk about that more later. Importantly, it goes way beyond negative screening, which is where most of us have heard of various values-based investing, right? We want to screen out companies we don't agree with. In the Christian church, we'll talk about that includes things like gambling, pornography, et cetera, abortifacients. But here, it might include things like the divestments of Israel, the divestment of fossil fuels, et cetera. It starts with negative screening. But then it moves far beyond that into active engagement and cultural change through investment policies. Some of that can look like positive screening. So I create a fund that over-invests in the type of things that I want to see. Diverse managers of companies, for example. Renewable energy, for example. Companies whose policies, like the Human Rights Campaign, are friendlier to LGBTQ employees, right? You might create a positively screened investment mandate that overemphasizes those things that you want to see happen. You might create thematic investments around things that you want to see materialize in the world more broadly. Renewable energy funds, for example, emerging manager funds, but thematic investing around the things that you want to see occur in the world. Then you get all the way out to activism and widespread active stewardship, things like proxy voting and corporate engagement. How many of you have heard of proxy voting? today. Amazing. When I started talking about this a few years ago, it would have been like Dave Bonson and I raising our hands and just about no one else. But there's been this thing in the popular imagination now where people understand it. And this is where the owners of private or public companies, by virtue of their shareholding, have the ability to influence the policies of those companies. At a base, they do proxy voting, which is where they take the ownership of those shares and vote on board resolutions, giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down that can range from new board members to corporate policies around those social issues or environmental issues that we talked about. And it also includes activism, where a company might engage through a hedge fund or even through board resolutions, corporate engagement. Our friend Jerry Boyer does this quite a lot in the Christian world, to try and adopt new policies or to force new resolutions on the ballot that are intended to push companies into certain types of behaviors. And ESG has begun to implement across all of these and all asset classes. They do so at the pointy end of the spear through a series of massive asset managers who not only are almost uniformly adopting the same principles, which is important from a voting perspective, which we'll come to, but who are controlling a huge plurality of the wealth in the world, of that $130 trillion that we talked about. If you just want one indication of this, the top 10 asset managers in the world, so 10 institutions, 10 CEOs, control just over 30% of the S&P 500, the 500 largest companies in America. If you look at just the top three, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, they control almost 20% of the S&P 500, so about 1/5 of every public company in America amongst the largest companies is controlled by those three asset managers. And it's almost it's over 28% of the S&P 600. So as you get smaller, they actually have a greater share. So almost a third of the S&P 600 is controlled by three institutions, all of which have adopted the series of practices that we talked about earlier. These numbers are a bit outdated, and there's been some restructuring. They unsurprisingly don't report this as transparently anymore. But in 2022, for example, BlackRock had a team of more than 70 dedicated professionals whose entire job was understanding the ESG framework, trying to formulate their corporate policies and corporate resolutions, and trying to action those in the way that they did activism within companies and the way that they did proxy shareholding. And interestingly, while Vanguard has backed off of this a bit, there are actually coordinated calls amongst all these institutions. There are coordinating convening mechanism amongst them and institutional investors that are all aligned towards trying to adopt the same sets of values to pressure companies in the public and private markets, which means when you go back to this idea that they own 30% of the American market amongst just these three companies, that they're the largest shareholder. So these three companies taken collectively are the largest shareholder in 90% of the S&P 500. So 90% of the largest companies in America are controlled by these three shareholders effectively as a plurality shareholder. That means those values that they're expressing become the values of the companies that they're investing with, which is some of the news that you've probably been seeing about this recently. Upstream of those are large pools of capital that actually started the ESG movement and have forced asset managers into adopting these principles. Now it's a kind of self-fulfilling cycle. But upstream of these are big institutional allocators that have their own values and priorities, many of which are aligned with ESG, some of which are quite different. At the forefront of these are sovereign wealth funds. So how many of you have heard of sovereign wealth funds, right? Super interesting entities, some of my largest clients in my old job. These are effectively the funds set up by countries, often that have natural resource wealth. So you see this a lot in oil-producing companies. The only sovereign wealth fund in North America is, does anybody know? The Alaska Permanent Fund. That's exactly right. That would typically be viewed as a sovereign wealth fund because of its oil wealth. Some of these really started the ESG movement. So the Nordic sovereign wealth funds, for example, which are among the biggest in the world, are very kind of politically progressive in an international sense, and they worked with the New Zealand superannuation scheme, the Australian superannuation scheme, to formulate a lot of the principles around ESG, and then to require the asset managers that they worked with to adopt those principles. So these big institutional allocators pushed the asset managers to adopt the principles that they cared about. But perhaps more nefariously, there are a series of other sovereigns that have a much more diverse group of interests that they also advocate for in American companies and international companies and asset managers. You'll see here two of the largest in the world, number 2 and 3 on this list, are the two investment engines of the Chinese Communist Party. The China Investment Company, which is over $1 trillion. Between the two of those, it's about $2.5 trillion, is often the largest client of every big institutional asset manager in the world. And the Chinese government, along with the governments of the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Singapore, Russia, and others, seek to enact national policy through their investment management mandates. This manifests sometimes when you see very positive treatment, for example, of China from large asset management companies in their research. The reason for that might be that their largest client is the Chinese Communist Party, which has certain restrictions on what it will allow its partners to say. You obviously see that influence in things like the purchase of American farmland, US tech companies, et cetera. And not all of this is necessarily bad. There are a lot of these firms that are actually trying to do good for their populaces, but they all have a series of values that they're seeking to express, and they're often quite effective at it. If you come closer to home, some of the leaders in values-based investing in America, for example, are large public pension plans, right? 3 of the most active of those in North America are 2 here in the state of California, CalPERS and CalSTRS, and 1 in New York Common, although there are many, many active public pension plans. I would say Taft-Hartley plans, public pension plans are among the most active values-based investors in the world, often enacting a series of politically derived policy priorities through their assets. Examples of that, CalPERS, for example, partnered with an organization, Principles on Responsible for Investment, on what's called the Climate 100, which helped to aggregate $54 trillion in assets globally to exert pressure on the biggest 161 publicly traded carbon emitters in the world to adopt more radical anti-climate change policies. So this one pension plan in North America, CalPERS, working with some of these others, aggregated $54 trillion to exert pressure on some of the biggest companies in America about its preferred policy proposal. CalSTRS has worked to deplatform firearms companies, for example, from financial institutions. So if you've seen that push, a lot of it has come from CalSTRS and related entities. And New York Common is one of the firms behind the push for diversity and equity inclusion in corporate leadership and board roles. The idea that you can't list on the NASDAQ now, for example, unless you have people with certain diverse characteristics on your board. So they're very active in trying to take policy proposals that they prefer as companies and exert the will for those through public companies and through private companies as owners through their assets. And what's interesting about all of this, so as I've been walking through this, you've probably seen some names that are familiar, because every single person in this room, there might be 2 people in this room who don't have these, has a State Street, Vanguard, or BlackRock product in your portfolio. I guarantee it. Go look at your retirement plan. Maybe 3 people don't. Go look at your personal holdings. You've got it. If you have an endowment, you've got them, right? If you're a member, if you're a resident of one of these states, your public pension plan is advocating for these things, right? So even if you look at your own portfolios, what's interesting about the little thing, you probably aren't a member of a sovereign wealth fund, although we may have some international participants here from the Nordics who are, or Alaska residents, but that's less likely. But each of these institutions has your money and is advocating for their values with your money in one way or another. And most of us have never really thought about that simple fact, right? Small managers can wield undue influence as well. So I kind of painted this picture, and you may be thinking, oh my gosh, what are we going to do against $54 trillion or $2.5 trillion from the China Investment Company and related entities or all these public pension plans? What's interesting is often small pools of capital can make a massive difference. The best example of this from a couple of years ago was this little hedge fund, Engine No. 1, which manages about 1/4 of the assets that my firm does. It held $12.5 million in ExxonMobil, $12.5 million in one of the largest companies in the world. It was like 0.0001% of the shares of ExxonMobil. And through advocacy for a radical climate change policy set of proposals, they were able to take 3 board seats in ExxonMobil, in one of the largest companies in the world, with the backing of large institutional investors, despite being less than 0.001% of the assets of that company. Small investors can make a big difference. And we'll come back to a more positive example of that in the Christian world here shortly. But before we get discouraged about just the scale of this and whether we can have any influence on it, what's interesting is that sometimes small players can make a big difference. Now recently, as you all have seen, there's been a pushback against ESG, right? The reason everyone in this room is aware of ESG, of proxy voting, of corporate engagement, what used to be very eclectic topics for nerds like me that were working in asset management company, is that there have been very public pushback. And these have come both on the left and the right of the political spectrum, actually. On the left, there have been concerns, for example, about difficulty quantifying ESG factors in greenwashing. The idea that you're labeling stuff ESG as a marketing tool, you're not really doing anything positive in the world. And that's very true. There have been a number of studies that have shown a lot of this is smoke and mirrors, just as a marketing tool to sell business. There's the potential for lower returns. So if you're a public pension plan, a fiduciary of other people's money, theoretically, you shouldn't be making big decisions that compromise the returns they take for values that they don't embrace, right? If someone's managing your money, they should be trying to manage it well. And so there have been a series of studies, many of them in mainstream institutions like Harvard Business School, that show that many of the ESG policies that were intended not to reduce returns actually have. So there's been a pushback on that. And then, of course, there are concerns about social and political bias, right? If you're on the political right, for example, ESG values often are very divergent from those that you would embrace. And if you're in the Christian world, there are a series of policies that are probably relatively out of line with most Christian denominations around life issues, around issues of human sexuality, et cetera, that are quite different than the dominant strains of Christian thought. So there's been all this pushback. And what I think is interesting about that is it opens a window for people of Christian faith, for people of all faiths, to not try and just say, let's get rid of this. Because I got to tell you, the train is out of the station. I don't think we're going back to neutral, which is what people sometimes talk about, even though in certain respects that's admirable. I think people want to express their values through investing. I think especially younger people definitively want to express their values through investing. I think you probably should express your values through investing to some extent. So the question now is that everyone's aware, can we as Christians come up not just with objections to this, but a distinctively new approach to investing that is a different set of values, that's uniquely tied to Christian faith, to Catholic institutions, that's reflective of what we know to be true about human flourishing, that actually does have a positive impact on the world with the trillions of dollars that we as Christians manage and influence? Can we replace some of the values that are antithetical to what we do with something more positive that can actually improve the lives of others? What's interesting is that historically, faith-driven investors have been the forefront of values-based investing, right? It's only been in the last 30 to 40 years that others have overtaken us. If you look through the thousands of years of Jewish scriptures, there are pretty clear commands about what to do with your money, right? Over 2,000 years, the Christian church has talked about that, both through the scriptures as well as through tradition, something that the Conference of Catholic Bishops, for example, has commented on. I saw some of the verse citations in there. The Islamic religion, for example, is the most active faith-driven investment manager in the world with trillions of dollars today in Sharia finance, which is adhering to Islamic principles. And if you go more recently, it was the founder of Methodism, Charles Wesley, who came up with some of the first modern negative screens 300 years ago. They'll sound familiar. He said you shouldn't invest in alcohol, tobacco, gambling, firearms, and slavery at that time. And if you fast forward even further to 1971, the modern activist investing movement was actually ignited by the Episcopal Church, which, owning a kind of similar set of shares to Engine No. 1 and ExxonMobil, had like 0.01% of shares in General Motors, and introduced a resolution at the board along with GM's lone black board member, a Baptist pastor from Philadelphia named Leon Sullivan, to cease GM's operations in apartheid South Africa until human rights issues were addressed. That resolution failed. It was voted down by other institutional investors. Notably, the Harvard University Endowment was a part of that. And yet, even in failing, it ignited a movement in corporate America, ultimately called the Sullivan Principles, that did indeed encourage corporations to help bring down the apartheid regime in South Africa, positive change. But since that time, we've gotten smoked. Values-based investing has become a mainstream thing, not a Christian thing. If you look at $54 trillion in US public market cap, 28 billion of that is in faith-driven strategies, mostly negative screening. Our firm estimates that somewhere on the order of $260 billion in assets have any sort of Christian faith approach embedded at all, usually very light negative screening or something of that nature, versus the trillions and trillions of dollars that Christians probably steward or influence around the world. And if we look at our own personal portfolios, I won't ask for shows of hands here, we're probably among those, right? I would guess that the average person and institution in this room has vastly more invested in conventional ESG strategies, whether they know it or not, than they do in faith-driven investments or things aligned with Christian faith, which is a disconnect probably for the way we live our values. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops have obviously issued guidelines on these. How many of you have actually seen the Catholic Bishops' guidelines? They're very good. It's a very thoughtful note. They lay out a series of frameworks. Very simply, there are a couple of different frameworks embedded, but they talk about avoiding doing no harm, which looks like negative screening, avoidance of certain things, actively working for change. That could be proxy voting, corporate engagement, and promotion of the common good, which is some of the more cultural change aspects, including what we call concessionary investing, which is where you take a lower return or a higher risk in order to achieve a missional goal. Something like microfinance, for example, or charter school bonds, where you're accepting that you're pursuing a missional objective rather than a financial return, is part of this promotion of the common good, in addition to some market return stuff. These are very thoughtful, but even some research out of Catholic University recently, for example, that I know some of you have helped on, including Andrew Abella is not in here, I don't think, but I know he was involved in this deeply, has shown that many of the ISS proxy guidelines and things like that mean that the institutions trying to address these guidelines in their investment policies are falling quite short, and even some of the proxy voting guidelines that are intended to adhere to this really don't, right? That they actually don't adhere to the policies that the Catholic bishops have outlined as much as they should. I think, again, this provides a great opportunity. So one of the charges coming out of this, and we'll do some Q&A as well, is for all of us to think about whether in the context of our retirement portfolio, our individual allocations, the institutions that we stored, how can we begin to express our values and the values of our church through those investments rather than the values of someone else? And how can we do so in a way that makes people's lives better, that leads to human flourishing? You can do this in the same ways that ESG is. You can negatively screen out some of the companies you don't want. I think that's great, and it's positive for you to get rid of some of those. I think that's just the beginning, and I actually think it's less effective than the next four things. Because as soon as you don't own something, you lose your influence with that company, right? If you get rid of all your shares of Disney as a Christian institution, you no longer have a vote with Disney, right? And so I think we should be really thoughtful about where in a negative screen versus where to engage and try and influence. You can positively screen for things that we care about, right? So you can try and emphasize those companies that we think are making a positive difference. You can get into engagement or activism, often with a third party helping you to do that, doing your proxy voting, trying to do corporate engagement on your behalf. And we've seen a number of successful examples of that recently, where you can engage on things like adding adoption benefits to a company rather than abortion travel benefits, where you can engage on trying to do things like employee resource group for Christians, right? There's one push now where John Deere apparently they've been in the news quite a lot, but today I saw they turned down a Christian employee resource group, which is like a club for people with an identity, even though they were allowing employer resource groups for many other types of identities, right? You can advocate for religious liberty in companies, the tolerance of people with Christian religious beliefs and their presence in companies, things that can be a positive influence on those companies, or even for things like chaplaincy. One of the things we advocate for all of our companies is chaplaincy, mentorship groups, employee benevolence funds, a series of practices that are deeply aligned with this love of God and love of neighbor that we're commanded to have in the boundaries of a company. And then you can do company and cultural formation. So one of the fun things about private equity, venture, real estate is you have much more control and influence than you do in public companies, no matter how many shares you own. When we buy a private equity company, it's very easy for us, partnered with the leadership team, to run through a playbook of what it looks like to implement Christian values in that company. right? Not to force anybody to be Christian, not to be inappropriate with folks, but to offer things like counseling resources, chaplaincy resources, family-friendly benefits like maternity and paternity leave that encourage family formation, a variety of other practices that can create cultures that outperform and also help people to flourish. And then, of course, there's concessionary impact, which we touched on earlier. Each of these is quite available to almost anyone with a pool of assets. And you can do it through your individual accounts, retirement plans, donor-advised funds, insurance general accounts, everything that you can think of. Almost any pool of assets can do this. Some are a bit more limited than others, like 401k plans. And finally, just like with engine number one, you can do this even with a smaller pool of capital. So I use some stats from our firm because I have those, and we're a relatively small firm. We manage about $850 million in assets. This number is a little bit outdated, but in private equity, that means that the employees who work for our companies are around 3,000 now. So we have the ability to directly influence the lives of those 3,000 people. In venture, because of the nature of venture-backed companies, that's over 5 million people globally that our policies have a chance to impact. In public equities, the companies we invest in have more than 3 million employees globally, many of which are actually adopting some of these best practices that I mentioned before now through advocacy and corporate engagement. Our multifamily housing group has more than 15,000 units with 20,000 tenants, and there's some really exciting stuff that happens within real estate now. I was talking to someone from Atlanta earlier who wants to focus on this. But for example, we recently partnered with a firm that's doing refugee and immigrant housing in Kentucky, for example. And the opportunity there is to be incredibly welcoming to this new group of people to our country, provide them with resources from within their immigrant community to control the community in the multifamily development, and then connect them to language resources, to work resources, to faith communities, to people who can help them integrate into society, which you can do in the context of an apartment building that you own. And if you own it, you're the person who gets to decide whether it's worth the cost. And then through our fund of funds, we've actually been able to invest in a number of amazing private equity and venture funds, one of which is in the room, that have deployed more than $3 billion against more than 90 companies around the world, having a leveraged impact across those areas with a very small pool of capital. I would guess that the assets in this room are greater than that $850 million. I know that at the Napa Institute conference this week, it's greater than that. I know some of the groups that are involved in the Catholic Church, and please don't feel offended if your logo is not up here. I only listed a few. I had to go on Google and copy images and things like that. But there are great Catholic institutions that have pools of assets that can be active in this space. Places like Innovest, Rich Todd's group, which gets to influence an enormous amount of capital and is doing so in positive ways. The Knights of Columbus, Ascension Investment Management, Catholic University, Ave Maria University, Belmont Abbey College, I think I met earlier. I'm not sure where he's sitting now, but other institutions that have an opportunity to influence this. And with hundreds of billions of dollars in the Catholic Church, with more than 1 billion Catholics around the world controlling trillions of dollars, this group could have just as much influence as anyone in the world. And they could have that influence for the Great Commandments and the Great Commission, right? We know what we're supposed to be doing with everything that we have, and our finances aren't relieved of that. We're told to align every resource, our talents, our treasure, with the principles of our faith. And the question for all of us is if this is the one area that we're kind of separating out and thinking of as quite different from that. The good news is there are a number of partnership opportunities now. So 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been a great number of providers who could help you in this journey. Asset managers, advisors, OCIOs, consultants who could help you to align your faith with your investment portfolio. And again, this is just a representative list. There are other firms out there. We have found, for example, more than 240 general partners of private equity and venture firms that are Christians, controlled by Christians in the country right now, many of whom who take their obligations as Christians very seriously. There are a number of ETF and mutual fund companies, a number of consultants, OCIOs, and advisors who can do this. So it's entirely possible, but it does take making this an explicit part of your investment strategy and pushing your advisors, finding the right advisor who will help you to do this, and pushing them to try and spend as much time advocating for your values, the values of your institution, as they would for any other set of values, including those exhibited in the mainstream. I'll end, our mission statement as a firm at Sovereigns is to love God and love our neighbor through investing. We're super uncreative as Christians. That's about the most boring thing that you could say, probably. Pretty unique among private equity firms. I don't think I've run into that mission statement at others. But to love God and love our neighbor through investing. We like to say there are really only 4 things you do with your money, right? You earn it, you spend it, you give it, you invest it. That's it. That's all you can do. We Christians think a lot about how we earn money, right? And how meaningful that is. There are a huge number of clergy at this conference dedicating their lives to meaningful work. Most of you are thinking very thoughtfully about how you work according to your faith, which David will talk about tomorrow. We think a lot about our spending and aligning it with our faith, right? We wouldn't spend on things that were misaligned. We try and not spend too much. We try and make sure we're living within our means. Our giving, we spend an incredible amount of time on. The average American gives 3% of their income every year. The average Christian's a little bit more than that, but not a lot more than that. And most big institutions only give away about 5% of their endowment every year, right? So it's a tiny little fraction. We spend so much time on it. Most of people's assets are not in earning, spending, or giving. They're in their investment portfolio. They're in their savings. And yet that 4th category is the one we spend the least amount of time thinking about aligning with the commandments of our faith, the gospel and the great commandments, right? And so my challenge to all of us as we go into this, to myself as well, is just thinking more consciously about how we can try and love God and our neighbor through our investing, and how we can seek to implement a set of values that reflect human flourishing and the Christian faith and the work that we do around the world. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I think we have just a couple of minutes for questions, and then you guys can get out of here for this evening's activities. Any questions for people? Yeah. Right here.
On the cultural impact front, in one of the slides there, what programs have you found that are most impactful for those employees or residents, you name them, that maybe don't cost as much, or it's a replacement cost versus a dramatically increased cost? I know obviously like more leave can cost that much more, and
So we get the question a lot. I should probably have a mic. We get the question a lot about you're an investor, how do you justify the increased cost of these programs against the investment return? One, I would say there is ample evidence that the basket of things that we talk about, I'll mention a couple, we actually have some playbooks for this, lead to the types of cultures that improve performance enough that they actually more than account for the cost of the program. So McKinsey & Company has done research, for example, on mainstream companies where top quartile cultures outperform median cultures by 60% and bottom quartile cultures by 200%. London Business School, Alex Edmonds has estimated that top 100 cultures versus median cultures in public markets outperform by 2.5 to 3.8 percentage points, which is about 50% basically in public markets. And we've observed this in our portfolio where when we implement chaplaincy, employee benevolence plans, when there's someone touching every employee, trying to take care of their needs, helping them prevent divorces, helping them work through substance abuse issues, absences go down, turnover goes down, customer satisfaction goes up. It's a remarkable series of benefits that you get from great culture, which is something that even mainstream institutions like McKinsey and LBS have recognized. And so my first answer is we think of it as an investment in the cost that will create a great culture, which will create outsized returns. An example of that that's actually wicked cheap that we think leads to a lot of returns is chaplaincy. There are great chaplaincy firms. Some firms we have a corporate chaplain, like that, just our chief pastoral officer who works on staff. Some firms use chaplaincy services like Marketplace Chaplains, Corporate Chaplains of America. They're incredibly affordable, and the statistics about their impact on people's lives and company performance as they're coming together are quite good. They reduce suicides, they reduce divorce rates, they reduce mental health problems, substance abuse rates, and all of those then have corresponding positive impacts on the company. There's not always quantitative research behind some of these things broadly, but chaplaincy is one. Employee benevolence funds are another, we find, which is where you set up emergency funds as a company to help with the needs of employees who are hurt. So at one of my partners' companies' movements, it's called the LoveWorks program. He seeded it with $200,000. someone has a health problem with their kid, their car breaks down, they don't have enough money to get to work, could be hugely disruptive. They can just take money, they can be granted money, just like a church benevolence fund, basically. We set one up for all of our portfolio companies as a GP, so the general partners just put some money in a pool, and we offer that to all of our portfolio companies that don't have one. And what's remarkable about it is twofold. One is those things never run out, because it ends up that employees then start contributing more than they take. So at Movement, the challenge now is the fund's too big. It's growing faster than they can distribute it. And so they have to limit that because employees want to love each other. They want to show love to each other. The second is it leads to conversations about why in the world as a company you would do that, right? And when they ask that question, you get to talk about your motivation for doing so, which is a remarkable opportunity to share the gospel. Right.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Frislovich. Thank you, John, for the presentation. My question is, do you think that mortgages on residential property square with the Christian principles?
Mortgages on residential properties at square, just the idea of a mortgage generally, or like institutional asset managers buying mortgages?
I suppose both.
That is a great question. You know, so this is actually a huge topic in Sharia finance, as you can imagine. It has not been a huge topic in Christian finance. I'll have to say I haven't thought deeply about this one. I don't have any natural disposition to opposing mortgages necessarily. I think there are practices in the industry that can be bad, for sure. But I haven't developed a good ideological, thoughtful position on that. Maybe I haven't been curious enough about that one. So I'll defer by saying I haven't thought deeply about it, but I don't right now have objections to it. I know in Sharia finance they have objections to mortgages. They've kind of found a workaround for that is structured differently, basically. And now mortgages exist almost everywhere. Yeah.
Thanks for the mic. Thank you. This is very helpful, very insightful. When thinking about BlackRock and the others and what they've been doing, I always thought it was quite divisive. We have a divided social, community writ large, and that they're kind of just finding ways around the law to do things that they can't pass through the law.
Yeah.
Everything that you just said, I think, actually has a good return on investment, as you were just describing right now. I won't repeat it. I could see that being kind of a bright line where, hey, okay, I'll propose Catholic social teaching through my investments that have good return on investment. But things beyond that, in my mind, could create division on the opposite end, the way BlackRock and the others are on their end. And to me, that would go a step too far. But I'm saying that as a challenge, perhaps, but really it's a question, just how to think through that.
So my disposition is that, I think all investments should have values. I think particularly the number of political issues that companies and investment managers weigh in on should go down. Like, I think the world would actually be better if investment managers and companies were much more small c conservative about the political and policy battles that they engage in and stuck more to the operations of the company. I think a lot of Christian values can be expressed in ways that are about human flourishing within the company rather than political battles outside. And I do think those can be done often. I think they can be done without financial trade-offs. Other people may have different opinions or data. I do think in certain instances, it's appropriate to weigh in on more public battles, or there may be instances where we may do something even if it has a negative impact on return. I'll give you one example of that. I'm involved with an institution that's chosen to totally divest of China right now. Some of that's prudent financial measures because we think there may be fraud. Am I going to get in trouble for using certain words? There may be inaccuracies in the way that those companies are reporting certain things. I've just gotten hacked right behind me. There are also very pressing human rights issues at play right now, et cetera. Will that country perform? Even if it did perform in the short term, I think that institution would make that trade-off because it matters. But I think you have to be thoughtful and small c conservative about which battles to pick. You should be conscious about those. But I do think it's at our discretion to say, sometimes consciously, we're just not going to do it, right? Even if it's profitable, we're not going to engage in it, we're not going to be a part of it, or we're going to push to implement new costs to address it. Like one of the things I think most of us would address, there's a push among certain Christian segments, which I think is really good, about building up better infrastructure about monitoring human trafficking in supply chains globally. There's not a lot of infrastructure around that. I would say, even if that costs extra money, as an investor, I would like to see that happen. And if it marginally lowers my returns, the human benefit of that would be great. So I'm actually agreeing with you mostly and just saying like, I think that's right on balance. And then there are a few issues where you might say, yeah, I'm going to make a conscious trade-off on this one. Yeah.
I hesitate to say this. I'm a small government guy, but when you see that concentration, are there public policy remedies that we should be considering to avoid that concentration of wealth from happening?
What's interesting is that the asset management industry, even though there is a lot of concentration, it probably doesn't. I'm not a legal scholar, but it probably doesn't reach antitrust levels at the level of concentrations we have today. BlackRock's the biggest at like 10%, basically. So it's concentration in terms of influence. In terms of the fragmentation of the industry, the asset management industry is pretty healthy in terms of competition. On ESG particular, everybody abides by the same rules, so that maybe is a thing, but antitrust doesn't apply to that. I do think there are some possible policy proposals around whether institutions should be able to engage with the proxy of investors who haven't specifically granted that. There may be policies around restricting the ways in which asset managers or institutions can use other people's money. Certain states are experimenting with that right now. So Kentucky, for example, is I think they've effectively banned ESG in the portfolios and have banned all values-based investing in portfolios. It's a pure fiduciary standard in Kentucky, I believe. And there are certain states that are going that direction. I'd probably go a slightly different direction. But I do think it's worthwhile for the government to think about whether there should be restrictions, at least on disclosures around what asset managers can do with other people's money. I would prefer more of a capitalist solution to the problem, and I don't think there are antitrust problems right now. So that's my personal. I think in general, some of the government regulators in the industry actually are pushing some of this stuff, and maybe if they just toned that down and let the market work, that would be better. But that's just my personal perspective. Yeah, maybe the last couple. I don't know how much time we have, but two more.
Father Philip Loray, I worked for over 20 years at the Pontifical Lateran University, and I just wanted to mention, because I saw the Vatican Bank logo, which is called the YOR. Pope Francis, about a year ago, began instituting a new metric for investing, and there are basically two entities. One is the Vatican Bank, and the other is the administration of the patrimony of the Holy See. So he's taking a lot from the American Episcopal Conference also on what it means to invest according to Christian values. So if anyone is going to have to do that, it's the Vatican. But it's been very slow, and I won't get into that. But here's my question. What if the companies aren't transparent? How are you going to know? For example, the Vatican had a large share in Johnson & Johnson. Well, they do some things that contradict Christian values. Yeah. And so that was just an example that, the Vatican never had stocks in Raytheon, for example, because that's obvious. I mean, it's an arms company. But what if you're a little shady, if you're not too transparent, and you can't really get caught? Can we invest in that?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. One is, with enough assets, you can always submit surveys to companies. So Rich will talk about on the panel tomorrow how they survey the asset managers that they work with now to determine the values alignment of those asset managers. Alliance Defending Freedom is doing this with a new set of surveys that they're putting out to public companies. I think there might be an opportunity for the church to consider whether a set of surveys that you could all align around on certain practices that you would find appropriate could be submitted, and at least you'd know whether people answer or don't answer. And typically, if a public company answers something on a survey, I think it's likely to be accurate. You could have fraud in that. You could have someone misleading. I think a US public company is predisposed to answer accurately on surveys by and large. I think whether we gathered that data is up to us, right? Because a lot of this is not stuff that they would naturally report on, I think, or wouldn't make sense for other financial metrics that they're reporting on. And then I think your question was related to, if you don't have certainty around something, should you still invest? Again, I have a slightly different opinion on this than some. I'm not a huge fan of screening out a lot of stuff. I'm a fan of screening out very obvious sectors that would be morally offensive to people, and then staying engaged with companies that may have elements of their business model that we don't like, and trying to vote, trying to introduce resolutions, trying to help them reform practices, which is kind of what ESG has done. They've divested very little and focused more on engagement and influence. And I think my personal predisposition is to only divest or negatively screen a limited amount, and then focus a lot on how we can positively engage. And the other thing I would say about that is I think sometimes Christians and conservatives in particular are prone to negative engagement, like we're going to beat up on some people. I think there's actually a really good opportunity here for collaborative engagement. The vast majority of CEOs of public companies don't want to be engaged in all the battles that they're being forced into. Many of them are Christians, many of them are people with traditional values, many of them want to see the best for their people, but they are surrounded. They're being hounded by one perspective right now. There's no one on the other side. And if Christian institutions were to speak up more, I think those CEOs would find there was someone in their corner on these issues where they could go to their boards and say, look, I know we're getting pressure on this, but I've got other people pressuring me. And I actually think we should stay neutral on this, or we should adopt a different policy. And so staying invested with the company gives us that opportunity, I think, for engagement. So with regards to Pope Francis's specific recommendations, I don't know enough to weigh in on those, but that's my general predisposition on the issue. Yeah.
Do you think the accredited investor rule unnecessarily pushes money to mutual? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Do you think the accredited investor rule unnecessarily pushes money to mutual funds, which then exert influence through those? And if you remove that, do you think there would be more kind of small dollars going to just regular public companies, or not being exerted through fund managers?
Yeah, so are you referring to keeping people out of private investments, basically, by requiring accreditation? Maybe this will be unpopular. I'm an alternative asset manager, so maybe this will surprise you. I'll say one surprising thing today. I actually think the accreditation rules are a good thing. I tend to think that if you're below the thresholds they've established are not that high, and I tend to think that it is difficult to determine whether someone has the level of sophistication to understand private investments or eclectic investments if their portfolio is limited. And so I think at the thresholds they're at today, I'm probably supportive of them. And I don't know that it pushes people necessarily into bad products. I think it pushes them into somewhat less sophisticated products. But I think that's like a risk-reward trade-off effect. This is like a very eclectic topic. There are some people who are like, I have no idea what he's talking about. But effectively, the SEC limits, if your net worth is X or below, you can't invest in alternatives, basically, in private equity, venture capital, et cetera. And it's intended to protect, quote unquote, less sophisticated investors. Some of those people with lower net worths might be super sophisticated, but the idea is alternatives should only be a small part of a portfolio for someone with limited assets. And so I think it's kind of a reasonable restriction at this time. Thank you very much. I don't want to keep you from the next things. Really appreciate it.